Good evening, everyone. You probably all know, or think you know, all about Jacob, because probably most of you have read it a number of times, but I hope tonight to make it live a little more than maybe it already does. This story involves three characters. We have God, of course, who's involved in everything. We have Jacob, and we have Esau. Now, because these two brothers were the family of Abraham, everything that they had to do with in their lives, God in the same way was going to be intertwined. We know the promises that were made to Abraham and eventually Isaac, and we know Jacob as well. But from their very birth of these two boys, Jacob and Esau, the natural order, as was accepted in those days, was upset. We know their mother was told by God that that would be so, that the elder would serve the younger, and she obviously kept that to herself. If she had told Isaac, it doesn't seem to have taken much notice of it. But God made a sovereign choice between the two of them. And the choice was Jacob. And he was going to be the one, as far as God was concerned, who is going to carry forward the Abrahamic promise through his children. Turn over with me, if you could, to Romans chapter 9 and see the comment that's made there by Paul in verses 10 to 13. Romans 9, beginning at verse 10. When Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our father Isaac, though they were not yet born, and had done nothing either good or bad in order that God's promise of election might continue, not because of works, but because of his call. The elder, she was told, will serve the younger, as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Just keep that in your mind, and we'll come back to the story where it begins. Come back to, if you would, to Genesis chapter 25, and we'll follow through their lives and see if we can see why that comment was made at that time. Genesis 25, and we'll start at looking at verse 27. So the boys have been born, the promise has been given to their mother. And when the boys grew up, in verse 27, it told us that Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. And we see there that Isaac loved Esau because he out of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So from the beginning there, we see there are two very diverse characters. Esau was a skillful hunter, meaning skillful. As we would say, if somebody was a good carpenter, they were skillful in making something very, very well, they were skillful. And that's what it means. It means skillful in that sense. It doesn't infer deceitfulness, as some of the old language might refer to. Because we have Daniel in later times being called cunning in the same context. But of course he was skillful in knowledge, as the word means. Esau was a man who spent his time out in the countryside, out in the open, away from the campsite, away from his father and his mother. And his approach to life was a physical one. As if he was a skillful hunter, it wouldn't be necessarily so. And he was content, as we see there, with the love of his father Isaac. And as far as he was concerned, everything would come to him in due course because he was the elder. Isaac loved him, and regardless of what else may be said, that would be the case. Because he thought, well, I can always buy my father's love because he likes the things that I catch out in the open and the food that I provide him He really likes that, so I can always buy my father if necessary. So his connection to his father and anything to do with his father and any promises that ever might have been made to him was just purely a physical one. Natural. No spiritual empathy at all. Isaac, I'm afraid at this time, as I said earlier, doesn't appear to exude that very much at this time in his life either. Now we know that the birthright normally fell to the elder son. Well, he took it for granted. He was the elder. He was loved to his father. He was the favourite. Then he didn't have to worry about it too much. It would come in due time. The spiritual side of the birthright seemed to have no significance to him at all. He failed to see in it any weight to be placed upon it. In Hebrews 12:16, which we won't turn to, his lack of appreciation is termed godless. And thus his character was summed up in those words. He despised it. He thought nothing of it at all. No weight upon it, no consideration, didn't matter. Whatever came with it he would receive because he was the eldest, and that ended that. No more thought. In chapter 25, verse 34, it bears out some of this. You know the story. Esau hungry. Jacob has something to give to him. So verse 34, Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils. He ate and drank. He rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now note there, he comes in famished for food. He agrees to give up his birthright for this food. He fills his stomach. And what does he do? He just rose up, went outside back to what he was doing before, gave no more thought at all to what he had apparently given away. Nothing at all. No reflection, no remorse at what he had done. In contrast, we see going back to 27 that Jacob is said to be a plain man, a quiet man, dwelling in tents. The vast difference between the two characters is seen there. Esau, very physical in his approach to life in every part of his life, whereas we find that Jacob remained close to the home, tents, and whatever toil he made, he never left home, so to speak. He was never far from home, which means staying amongst tents. And there's the inference to the very diverse characters of the two brothers. And of course, from God's position of knowing the characters through and through, and this is the point of most of this story, he saw that he could work with Jacob. God knew that he couldn't work with Esau. And so before they were even born, the decision of God had been made. Sometimes we find people use quotes to try to show the true mind of Jacob at this time. And I've read some pieces that tend to infer that he probably spent about 15 years of his first part of his life when Abraham was still alive. And so the living, being a quiet man and living in tents, maybe infers that he had a lot to do with Abraham, and Abraham would have spoken to him and maybe laid a good foundation. That may be so, but it certainly didn't do much, didn't have much imprint on his character in his early years. So we'll put that aside, because in the end, it was God working with him that changed his character. So this time of his life anyway, he was a quiet man, plain man, didn't really show much. His nature was not a very God-fearing one. It was just simply a contrast to the character of Esau. And that, of course, is borne out in that story when Esau comes in famished. Esau was willing to give up his birthright for a feed, and Jacob was willing to take it for giving him one. But he wasn't going to give him a feed until he was told, yes, I'll exchange the birthright for the food. That shows a bit of the character of Jacob at this time. You give me that and I'll give you this. You've got what I want. You've got what I want. Exchange, fair exchange, we'll go our way, no more to be said. This was not an act of faith. It was simply an opportunity to supplant his brother because, well, his mother had said that God had said he would, so that's just another way of doing it, isn't it? No more thought of Jacob put into it. And of course, he would have known, possibly from Abraham and from his mother, that the Abrahamic blessings were attached to the birthright. But I feel at this point of his life, how much weight was again placed in them is debatable. And it's just the contrast between these two men that has made the point here. A lot of work had to be done upon this man's character by God before weight was indeed placed upon those promises. 50 years go by. Isaac's now 137 years old. He's feeling his age. His brother, I think, had died at about this age, so he was feeling, well, he feels near death. His sight's not too good. But he seems determined to bless Esau, regardless of what God had stated would be the case. There's deliberately no mention in this situation of Jacob. And so in the next chapter in their lives, the contention between Jacob and Esau is played out, again revealing their characters. In chapter 27 we find this. We know the story again, I feel, well enough to not have to read every verse. Rebekah colludes with Jacob to deceive Isaac so that he might gain the blessings, as, well, Rebekah says that God had told me you're going to have them, so I'm going to make sure you do. So you can be the head of the family. What happens? Lies, deception follow. Look at verses 11 and 12 of chapter 27. Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, "Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I will seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing." What do you mean? What does he think he meant by saying, "I will seem to be mocking him"? Of course he was mocking his father, wasn't he? That didn't seem to matter. Again, gaining the birthright, deceiving his father, again, didn't have much weight upon it. So again, I say, a man of faith, a man of God at this time of his life, I'd have to say, not very. Instead of saying, I may seem to be a deceiver, why couldn't he be honest with himself and just say, I am deceived my father, and leave it at that, or make no comment? Even though it might have been his excuse, well, my mother told me to do it, suggested it, so I'm just following her will. Or did he excuse himself with the thought, like we said before, God wants me to have it, so here's another opportunity. I'll take it. Now that may be an excuse, but not a reason. It may be an excuse on a human level, but not on God's. So no, again, the story, lies follow lies. But the blessings are his. He's got it. Don't matter about deceiving his father. That didn't seem to matter at all. We know from the New Testament, we're told in 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 6 that we're not to defraud our brother. And the same sort of inference is, of course, in the law of Moses. But here he was doing it, wasn't he? It didn't seem to worry him too much at all. Genesis 27:35. Genesis 27:35. She said, "Your brother came with guile," this is Isaac, "and he's taken away your blessing." And Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" Now, the reaction of Esau at this time, put yourself in the position of Esau. Wouldn't you react in such the same way and from a human level as Esau did? He had every right, in inverted commas, to feel like this, to say what he said of Jacob, and really in a way to look at his father and say, "Well, why did you let him do it?" So he was certainly rightly upset. Verses 34 and 36. Verse 34 says, Esau heard the words of his father, and he cried out with an exceeding great and bitter cry, and said to his father, "Bless me even so." And in verse 36, is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright. Behold, now he has taken away my blessing. Of course, that wasn't strictly true, but at this point in time, that's the way that Esau saw it. I think sadly for Esau, he presumed that Isaac was going to bless him and all the blessings would come to him regardless of whether he had sold his birthright earlier. That seemed to have slipped from his mind, because he says that he even thinks to himself that he's taken my birthright and taken my blessings. He thought, "I'm the favoured son, then I'll get them anyway." But here twice now he's been supplanted by his brother. Hebrews 12 verse 7 comments on 12 verse 17 comments on this part of the story, and it infers that there was just no change of heart of Esau. He didn't stop and think what he had done and how it had happened in the first place, and so maybe of sort of change of heart. No, all we're told, he got angry, tears of frustration before his father, loud cries, but that wasn't going to change things, and Isaac knew it, and in the end, Esau knew it too. In verse 41 of chapter 27, now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessings with which his father had blessed him, and Esau said to himself, "The days of my mourning for my father are approaching, then I'll kill my brother." Now it appears now the rift between the two brothers is irreparable, and certainly on a human point of view, it certainly would have been. Thankfully for Jacob, these words that Esau obviously spoke out loud in the hearing of others was taken to Rebekah, and she was made aware of what Esau intended to do. And so she urges Jacob to flee, rightly fearing for his life, knowing what a physical man Esau was. Knowing his characteristics, as she would have done, she would have known that he would, when the opportunity arose, do just that. Verses 44 and 45. She says, "Stay with him a while." This is, "Go to Laban, my brother, at Haran. Stay with him a while until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and fetch you from there. Why should I bereft of both of you in one day?" So from that it appears as though Esau was a hot-headed sort of man who got very angry very quickly, but then if he couldn't sort it out then and there, he put it aside and in time, maybe forgot about it. But if the occasion ran again, maybe it would come to him. She was hoping that going away to Laban would appease him enough and he'd forget about it and go on with his life, and she would not lose both sons. So he does. He again deceives his father in a way by saying, by his mother suggesting that he needs to go and find a wife from the family, and the family's back in Haran, and Isaac concurs, not realising the situation behind it. So again, he leaves under false pretensions. A man of faith, God-fearing? No. But he goes with his father's blessing, and in essence he gets in Genesis 28:33-4 the Abrahamic blessings from his father. But he leaves in fear of his life. He knows that Esau has spoken those words out loud. He knows he means them. So he leaves to go to a country he'd never been to before. He goes away from being near the tents, so anywhere within 50 k's maybe from where he was unfamiliar with. He goes away from the inheritance of the land that the Abrahamic promises seem to suggest were his, to dwell as strangers. And he says, in essence, oh boy, if I live that long. That's his mindset at this time. So off he goes. And he travels. Verses 3-4, he gets those blessings from Abraham and off he goes. Now he travelled about 2 days, looking behind him, I think, all the time, expecting Esau to appear over the hill behind him. He was certainly out of his comfort zone. He was on his own. He was out of his territory, foreign to him in every way, away from his tents. Inhabited by people he didn't know anything of. Now, I don't know if I got this right, but I measured it, so I'll have to take it as it is. After 2 days, he travelled about 50 miles of a possible 450 to get to where Laban was. Now, you might correct me afterwards, and that's no hassle, but it was a long journey. That's what I got from measuring the maps anyway, so we'll go with that at the point in time. So he's been travelling, probably I would guess, without much rest, I'm sure, without much rest. Exhausted physically, mentally down, he lays down to sleep. And he dreams. There's that dream of the ladder that reaching from heaven to the earth, and angels going up and down upon it. I don't think that the significance of the ladder and the angels ascending and descending upon it would have not been lost on Jacob. This is one of the interventions of God in his life. Very real. Hang on, Jacob, just stop and think for a moment. Promises have been made to you, and any promise made by God that relates to you, especially the Abrahamic promises, he will bring about. God had always been there. God had always been accessible to him. Jacob just had to open his eyes. And that is no different from you and from I. The part of the promise at this time in his life that seemed to have more weight to him, to his pinched, and I'll call that his pinched spiritual mind, is found in verse 15. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done that of which I have spoken to you. So there was a very firm promise made by God, a very individual promise made to him that God has some work to do with him. He will accomplish it, he will take you where you're going, and he will bring you back again, safely. Remember that. This is probably a watershed moment in his life, this intervention of God. And to some degree at least, maybe Jacob can see that God is there, though he's maybe just beside him at this time, or maybe even behind him, not really with him as he sees it. Because as we know, the next few years of his life, he continues to try to manipulate the things that are happening around him to his advantage, time and time again. But God blesses him because of what God wanted him to be, and how God was in his life, even though Jacob at this time didn't seem to get it. Verses 20 and 21. Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house of peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone will set up for a pillar in its place." Maybe he did realise at some point here, in a small way, that God was in control, but he didn't seem to want to let God have complete control of his life. God's statement that he would be in his life, take him to this place he was going safely, bring him back again in safety, is followed by that vow of acceptance and acknowledgement that God would do it. But his words appear still a bit, well, if you do, I will. Again, I have to call it a pinched man of faith. It was there as the kernel, but it needed a lot of work by God to make it bear fruit. It did eventually, as we know, but it took a long time. And I think that is the very essence of this story for you and I in this day and age, as we said in that preamble and beforehand. That God does work in our lives, there's no doubt. God is in control, there is no doubt. And any promise made that refers to us, he will bring about. He may intervene in our life in many times, but whether we acknowledge it or not, then it is up to us, because God is trying to work with us. So he has a little bit of a different mindset now. He's justified in some way, he feels, because God says he's going to be with him. He is strengthened physically and, we hope, spiritually. And so away he goes again. And some 16 days later, he gets to Haran. We know there that he meets Rachel, again by God's grace. But as often happens in our life when we think everything's going well, faith is tested, as his was at this time, severely at times in the next few years, by, as we know, the deceitfulness and the manipulation of Laban. He had met a man with the same characteristics as Jacob had, and the deceitfulness and the manipulation that occurred between the two of them is another story in itself. Come over to chapter 31, verses 5 and 7. Verse 5. I see that your father does not regard me with favour as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. And so it goes on. And so this is a time when there weren't too good a situation between Laban and his sons and Jacob. And all these things have been going on in their life where Jacob appeared always to get the upper hand, and of course Laban and his sons did not look too well upon it. Verses 11 and 13. The angel of God said to me in a dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see all the goats that leap upon the flock are striped, spotted and mottled. And for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. So here was his dream, another intervention by God in his life that showed to Jacob, God is in control, God is there right with you. Remind him in verse 13, I am the God of Bethel. Remember that, Jacob? Where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go forth from this land, and go back to the land of your birth. So Laban and his sons are showing hatred to Jacob. God again appears to him and strengthens him and says, I'm there, I'm with you, just do what I tell you to do. Probably God's words here were an answer to a prayer from Jacob. I'm only presuming that, but I feel that's probably the case. It's as if God was just waiting for Jacob to call to him. And how often in Scripture does God make those sort of statements? He's waiting there to hear our call. He's got the strength. We just have to admit that we need him and access the strength that is his, and God will give it. I'll protect you, God says, wherever you go. Don't worry about repercussions from Laban. Won't happen. Don't worry about Esau either. Go back to your land. Go home. So in those verses he acknowledges that God has prospered him. He gathers all his possessions unbeknown to Laban, and he leaves quickly. He cried out to the Lord, and he realised that God had answered him, and he realised that God heard when he called. So he couldn't trust Laban. There's no point in saying, Laban, I'm leaving tomorrow. Let me get my gear together, and I'll shake hands with you and let Rachel hug you, and he'll go. Laban was not that kind of man, and he knew it. Just go, as God had said to him. And it says he fled. It literally means he bolted. So as quickly as he could, he gathers his possessions, his wives, his children, and without looking back, he bolted. But of course the bolting would have been slowed down quite a bit because of the family and the herds and the flocks and everything he had with him. So the bolting, he might have left with the idea of quickly, but the travelling wasn't very quick, sadly for him. It was a slow journey, but luckily for him, as God would have it, Laban was away shearing, quite a way away. And it was going to take a while, even when Laban found out, to catch up with him. And they hoped they'd be outside his kind of country where he would think he would have power by then. Chapter 31, 23. Chapter 31, verse 23. After Jacob fled, he took his kinsman with him, and after Jacob had fled. On the third day was told Laban, so he takes his kinsman with him and pursues him for 7 days and followed close upon him into the hill country of Gilead. So it was about 13 days, or thereabouts, since Jacob had left, since he'd bolted and was going as quickly as he could, before Laban heard about it, got back from his shearing, got his crew together, and then chased after Jacob and caught up with him. By this time, they had travelled about 200 miles and got to the area of Mount Gilead. They were still only halfway home. Unbeknown, as we see in verse 24, that God had appeared to Laban and said to him, even though you catch up to him, don't you dare do anything to him. Don't threaten him in any way. Don't try to persuade him to change his course, because I have said he's going that way. When they meet, Laban leaves Jacob in no doubt that if God hadn't appeared to him, then Jacob's life would have been worth anything. And he would have taken all those flocks, all those herds, his daughters, his grandchildren, and he would have taken and probably left Jacob worse for wear. That's Laban's character, and sadly, along the way, some of those points have been shown in Jacob's character. But he was learning now, because he was on the other side of the fence, and it was being returned to him. So they make a non-aggression pact, and they both go their ways. Jacob went on his way home. So he doesn't have to worry about Laban anymore. He knows that for sure. But where's he going? He's going home. Where's Esau? Home. He's going to where Esau lived. He's still got half the journey to go. What do you think would be playing on his mind for those next 200 miles. Wouldn't be a happy chappy, I wouldn't imagine. In chapter 32, verses 1 and 2, I believe another prayer was probably answered by God. 32, 1 and 2. Jacob went on his way, so he leaves Laban and he goes on his way, and the angels of God met him. And Jacob saw them and he said, "This is God's army." So he called the name of the place Manahaim. So God, probably in answer to his prayer as I feel, showed him there starkly, not only have I said I'll be with you, but look around you. Look at all those angels I'm surrounding you with. God's army is there with you to take you home. Forget about what Esau thinks he might do to you. I'm surrounding you with my army. What stronger thing do you think could be given to you if you're in that sort of position and were able to see that? It would strengthen you beyond measure, wouldn't it? So his eyes were maybe opened a little bit further to the nearness of God. He was not alone. But they didn't just appear then, did they? They were always there. And that was something he had to learn. Of course, we have that wonderful comparison, if we think of it, of the Lord Jesus Christ, who when he was in a position before he gave himself a sacrifice, in answer to his prayer, God sent angels to strengthen him in the course that he would to follow. So away they go again, still 2.5 weeks from home. So Jacob thinks it's probably a good idea to see if he can send some messengers ahead and see if he can find out how Esau is feeling, whether he's busy out hunting, whether he's got ideas of watching out if Jacob returns. Suss him out. So he sends off his messengers to do so. No mobile phones in those days, was there? I don't think. He sends these messengers away, many days' journey, and he's slowly plodding on with the rest of his crew. And he has to wait, still wondering what's going to happen, until the messengers come back again. And as we read in verse 6, messenger returned to Jacob saying, "We came to your brother Esau and he's coming to meet you." And 400 men are with him. Jacob, remember the angels around you? That was pushed from his mind for the moment. Jacob with 400 men. I only got my servants untrained, my wives and children, and all my hundreds of the flocks. He can only be coming with one intent, can't he? To destroy me, take my family, do what he said he was going to do in the first place, take my life. How can I get around this? What can I do? He seeks reconciliation in a certain way. He, as we read in there, he sends waves, for want of a better term, of his servants and his cattle and his flocks and in front in waves, all separated by a distance, to kind of placate Esau and his 400 men with him. So again, he, without, it seems, praying to God at this time, he goes ahead to sort things out himself. Not remembering that God said he would be with him and would take him home. You don't have to worry about Esau. I am with you. But of course, we know, on the human level again, fear can be a very real thing. Distress of what you think might be going to happen can be a very, very real thing, even though your faith in God might be strong. But this time, he seems to think that all that he's done there hasn't stopped Esau. He's still coming. What next do I do? What next do I do? So he proceeds on a human level. He's trying to thwart a total destruction of his family, even thinking that if like it says there in chapter 32, that if one lot gets, Esau comes upon one group of them and destroys them, the others might escape. Then we get to Jacob's prayer. Jacob prays in verse 9 to 12. He begins with an appeal to the one God who made those precious promises to him. And my God, the Father of Abraham and God, Father of Isaac, O Lord, who did say to me, very specific prayer to me, return to your country, to your kindred, and I will do you good. So you never remind God of anything, of course, but you are acknowledging that God has said that to you, and that is a promise to you. A covenant, in fact. A personal covenant blessing that he made to him. And then he acknowledges that he's not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness. Note that the faithfulness he acknowledges that God has shown him, because God had been with him throughout his life, even though he might have acknowledged it at the time. You have shown to thy servant your faithfulness. For with only my staff I crossed Jordan, and now I have become two companies. And so then he asks, deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him. And he had right to fear him, of course he did, lest he come and slay us all. But thou didst say, I will do you good, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So again he acknowledges that God had made promises to him, that God is both willing and able to bring about those promises. So he makes those statements that are firm, knowing that God has intervened before, trusting on the surface anyway that that God would intervene again. Be still in fear of Esau. And what does he do now? Excuse me. This time, he's already sent away all his flocks, all his family, and this time he even sends his wife and his wives and his family over the brook and leaves himself alone. Pray. Pray. He's left alone with his mind full of the fear of Esau. And I think fear probably engulfs him here. For once again he admits he needs the help of God. Deliver me, I pray thee, as verse 11 says. Pray and then act should have been the mantra that Jacob and, of course, we live by. Not act and then pray. And it seems that he'd done all these things before he got to pray to God. I've done all I can, so maybe now I'll bring God into the equation and God can add to what I've done. It's the wrong way around, isn't it? Because, most of his previous life, he'd acted with little thought of God. God's involvement had been on the periphery of his life. He had gone in all the time, thinking that he could control things. He gets to the point in his life now where he's done all he thinks he can do, and he's left alone. I've done all I can do. Maybe he did realise now that without God's intervention, even what he had done wasn't going to be sufficient. His life, the life of his family, was in grave danger. He needed saving. And he acknowledges that God was the only one in those verses of his prayer that had the power and the will to protect Jacob and bring forth that promise as he had said. So he concludes his prayer in verse 12 as we read, reminding himself of what God had said to him. God had said, "I will do you good and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." Those words coming almost directly, as we know, from the promises made to Abraham. That concludes his prayer, referring to those promises. But they obviously couldn't be fulfilled, could they, if Esau destroyed his family? So maybe now he's realising that God both has the will and the power to bring them about. Therefore, we will be safe. So all the things he's done to placate Esau were of no use and weren't needed in the end, were they? But it's hard for us on the human level to think like that, but we need to. Verse 24. Jacob was left alone. A man wrestled with him until the break of day. He wasn't alone, was he? There was God's angel, just one of the multitude that surrounded him, just one of the multitude that had always been with him through God's power. And brothers and sisters, young people, neither are we. We are not alone. God perseveres with his children. Jacob was one of his children. By God's grace, we are too. And he perseveres with us. He intervenes in our life to bring out that trust and that love that needs to be engendered between the Heavenly Father and his children. The thing he wants from us, his children, his servants. We are no different from Jacob. God perseveres with us. And that's why I said it in that introduction piece about, I feel it mirrors many of us. I feel that mirrors me, and I'm sure it probably mirrors you as well. But God does persevere because he wants to give us the kingdom.